Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. In this episode, Karl Folk from the Institute of Unreality and I discuss the latest developments in the information war around the 2024 United States presidential campaign and how authoritarian ideas and messaging are being used to lay the ground for Trump's Project 2025 agenda. Stick around.
This is a crusade. This is a holy war against the deep state.
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution.
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Which I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
Karl, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm great, man. Really glad to have you back again here.
Yeah, glad to be back.
So, part of the problem with only doing one show a week is that sometimes you record something and then events happen and situations develop and you end up with some clarity about how things actually happened. And the show that you recorded a few days ago isn't quite as relevant anymore.
No.
And that's not the first time this has happened here on the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, and I'm sure it won't be the last, but we like to fix it when we can. And since we have some more clarity about almost everything we talked about, we decided to go ahead and update things.
Yeah.
And one of the main things that we talked about was the Reich ad that the Trump campaign decided to share. And in case you missed it, it was a list of newspaper headlines as a campaign ad, and at the end of the ad, clearly visible, was the phrase Unified Reich. And people went apeshit because this is Trump and he's spent about the last decade acting like a Nazi.
Yes.
And when you give people information that confirms their priors, they're going to jump on it real hard. And people did. The Trump campaign deleted the posts. They walked it back. They were saying it was a random video that some low-level staffer found on the internet, and it was never meant to cause this kind of ruckus. And boy, do you people overreact to everything. And that's pretty much where things were when we talked about it.
Yeah.
And we know a lot more about what happened since then. One thing that came out was that the creator of the video template that they used was identified. It's a content creator from Istanbul, Turkey, and apparently he left that line in as filler text, like Lauren Ipsum or something. He says he's not a Nazi sympathizer and that he had no desire or intent to influence the American election, and I personally believe him because I have no reason not to.
Same.
He's who most of the coverage of that ad has been focused on. And I think that's a mistake because, like he said, he didn't make the ad. He just made the template. Now, BBC journalist and previous Did Nothing Wrong podcast Mike Wendling actually asked what, in my opinion, is the relevant question, and that's who actually made the ad. Turns out it was this guy.
And here's what I'm going to tell you, MAGA. I'm going to tell this to all of you guys. It's not your responsibility to correct fake news against your enemies. That's the fucking left's responsibility. Some of you guys don't get this. You don't know how to fight. You're busy being virtue signaling dickwads, all right? And I love you, but sometimes you're virtue signaling dickwads. Dilley, why'd you do fake news about Liz Warren and the Mammy Pot? Because fuck Elizabeth Warren. That's why. I told all of you, it doesn't have to be true. It just has to go viral. And I stand by that statement when it comes to our enemies. And I'll make I'll be okay. I'll make my bed. I'll lay in it. And I'll deal with my creator. And I'll say, hey, I'm sorry about some of that fake news I spread against terrible people. You think that I know whether Megan Rapinoe is actually a Satan worshiper? Of course not. Of course not. I have no idea. There's some stuff that makes you wonder. There's some stuff that makes you wonder, okay? Makes you look, oh, she might be a Satan worshiper. Do I know that definitively? Did I throw that out there and get it to go viral? I had another dipshit yesterday he tried to fact check me on that one. Why are you taking up for Megan Rapinoe? Why are you defending Megan Rapinoe? Whether she is or isn't a devil worshiper doesn't fucking matter to me. That dirty piece of shit is a horrible representation of the United States of America and our values. And if all I've got to do is link together a couple of fucking things that make her look like a Satanist to take some shine off that bitch's moment, I'll do it every time. A lot of you don't know how to fight. And a lot of you don't have the fucking guts to do what I'm doing because, frankly, you're probably better people than I am.
This gentleman's name is Brendan Dilley, and he runs a group called the Dilley Meme Team. He and his group are responsible for some of the most vile content of the cycle, including some incredibly sexist attacks on Nikki Haley. And their motto, stated by Dilley, is, "It doesn't have to be true. It just has to go viral." And the Trump campaign loves him. Trump himself has shouted out Dilley on Truth Social, and they've provided him and his team with backstage footage from the Iowa caucuses. And this is not the first time they've used his content either. This is from a piece by Phoebe Jones from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey entitled "Christian Nationalism in the Case of the Dilley Meme Team." Quote, self-identified as Trump's online war machine, they produce content with the ultimate goal to re-elect Donald Trump. The Dilley Meme Team creates memes, video content, deep fakes, and shallow fakes that target members of the both figurative and actual left, as well as former Republican candidates who ran against Trump in the primary election. Prominent victims of their trolling include Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, President Joe Biden, Nikki Haley, and Governor Ron DeSantis, whom the Dilley Meme Team targeted with the explicit goal of getting him to drop out of the election. We'll link to the piece because it's fascinating to see how they use a group's signifiers and symbols to program to that group, and it's really, really similar to what they did here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, what you see is things like, Carrie Lake shouted them out by name, right? Like she said, thank you to the Dilley Meme Team and things like that. These are people who are deeply ingrained in the far right messaging apparatus and the weaponized unreality they're creating, right?
Absolutely.
And they're pretty clear about it. Like that article spells it out really clearly that this isn't about anything beyond getting Trump elected and using pretty much the worst tactics available to do it.
Right.
If we were looking at this outside of this country, like in a geopolitical way, we would say this is information war. Because they're essentially running an information war racket that is clearly a plausibly deniable situation that's outside the
official constraints of the campaign.
Exactly. And it's the same thing that we've seen with Trump and this crew, not specifically the Dilley team, but like the Chuck Johnsons of the world. This is the same thing that happened there, right? Where Trump and his team understand that if they have essentially outside consultants, air quotes, as big as my hands, they never have to take responsibility for anything they do.
Right. And these guys are, if the comparison's a little strained, I don't really think so. Seems very much like if you go back to 2016 and you look, there was a group with Mike Cernovic and Jack Posobiec and some other guys, and they called it MAGA 3X.
Yep.
And it was running basically what looked from the outside like an unlicensed PAC, where they were doing these same kinds of ads. It was more in person. This seems to be all virtual at this point.
Yes.
But it was the same sense of like, when we have something we don't want to do ourselves or we can't do ourselves because the optics of it suck, we're going to outsource it to these guys.
Yeah.
We're going to let the dark PR shop do it.
Yeah, and I think dark PR is really the way to look at this, right? Like these are people who deeply understand and say the thing that they're trying to do, which is influence the election in any means necessary. And what we've found time and time again, both here and abroad, is it doesn't need to be true. It just needs to feel good for the people who it's made for. And, we've seen that repeated in iterations upon iterations here since the election in 2016. But this is, in my mind, something more brazen in a certain way, right? Like this is very much a bigger, darker message to go along with kind of this dark vision that Trump not only is painted, but is telling people he's going to enact day one.
Basically, they know that that they're lying and they don't care.
Yeah.
And I read something once about a Russian concept called Vranyo. And it means, I'm full of shit and I know I'm full of shit, but I'm going to tell you how things are and you're going to write it down. And we're both going to act like it's real.
Yeah.
And this seems to be a lot like what the Dilley Meme Team is doing. I mean, they make memes, video contents, deep fakes, and shallow fakes. They're admitting they're making these things.
Yeah.
This isn't a secret. You can listen to Dilley's podcast, although I kind of recommend you don't. But he airs a virtually daily podcast where he rants about one thing and another, and he admits what they're doing. And to him, this is how politics is now. It's war. Yeah. And he's going to do whatever it takes that he can do to fight for his guy, which is Trump.
Yeah, I mean it's total war, politics style, right? Like this is something that they've been very clear that they have embraced and wanted at some level for a long time, because they've created a narrative that the Democratic Party has been doing this to them forever, right? Like their big gripe is that, well, they've done this to us, why can't we do that to them? And the reality is the Democrats just could out-message most people when people were listening to the facts, right?
Right.
And so, you know, I mean, I just keep thinking about the reality-based community comment of the early 2000s from the White House.
Right.
And this is just an extension of that, right? Like, this is the logical next step for people who hold in contempt those of us who really do not just believe in standards for democratic norms, whatever, but also a floor level of truth, right?
Right.
And when you have someone like the Dilley team, whose express goal and you know, clearly stated intention is to win by any means, you are going to see things that are meant to inspire outrage, and then have basically those same groups turn around and say, well, you're just triggered by us having power again.
Right.
This is the same iteration of that and the Roger Stone 2016 maneuvers that gave us everything we're dealing with now.
And Roger Stone, how many times did he quit the Trump campaign in 2016? At least 3.
Yeah.
He was supposedly not working for Trump anymore. He quit. He's done. And it just never really seemed to stick somehow. Those stories are for getting the name in the news. Those stories are for getting people to like pay attention to whatever it is he's trying to say. And these guys are almost the same way. It's really just, it's frustrating because they don't seem to care in the slightest about the truth of any of this.
Yeah.
They really don't have that sort of sense of, well, okay, sometimes your guy is wrong. Their guy is never wrong. I think most people in the Democratic Party and on the left can think of at least several things they're not wild about how Joe Biden's done things. Some people can think of more than several things. Some people can think of a whole list. But the point is, I think we tend to be a little more clear-eyed about that. And these people aren't going to hear a word about what their guy did, what their guy is doing, what their guy is prepared to do to actually win this thing.
No, and I mean, the silo that we've all found ourselves in is bad. And the Republican silo is damn near complete, right?
Yeah.
Like most of the Trump part of the party live in an alternate ecosystem that's not just Fox News, right? Like I think people have falsely seen this as, well, this is just a Fox News issue, when in reality it's a Fox News issue in conjunction with people like the Dilley team.
Yeah.
And then other news, and that has big air quotes around it, news sources that are predominantly right wing. And they're not just sheltered, they're literally living in a parallel stream of reality, right? Like they just don't understand any of this. And, you know, that's increasingly happening to all of us, whether we're Republican, Democrat, leftist, whatever. We're all increasingly living in isolated outposts in the real.
Right.
And I saw some polling today about the country as a whole, their knowledge of Project 2025, for example, right?
Right.
And what's really interesting is that polling showed that no one really knows about it, whether Republican, Democrat, or otherwise. And, you know, there's a level of understanding this as a messaging war as much as it is a political act. And the Dilley team, they don't focus on truth, but they focus on message.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a massive rift here in not just the way that things are messages, but the understanding that messaging is important.
Mm-hmm.
So people understand the thing that they're dealing with. On the right, they're focused on pulling people away from what is real. And the liberal side, it just doesn't seem can focus.
Yeah.
And so when you have those things combined, something like the Dilley Meme Team, something like Bannon or Project 2025 have a much greater shot of existing in the real world with all of us and impacting everyone's daily life in really unbelievable ways.
And it is, because these people have figured out how to get their content in front of a whole lot of people. They figured out how to juke the media.
Yep.
In the same way that people like Microchip had figured out how to juke social media in the 2016 campaign. Now you've got guys like Dilley that are figuring out how to send some outrageous shit up the flagpole and make the media just bite at it, but they're still able to plausibly walk this back. And to what you said about ecosystems, that's one thing I think a lot of people that don't swim in this shit quite as deeply as people like us do. And they say, you know, that's just Fox News. And I hate to break it to you, but Fox News is kind of the left of that ecosystem.
Yes, it is.
That's the part I think people don't quite get, is that like there's a whole lot to the right of Fox News. And one of the things that's to the right of Fox News is a thing that is called America's Voice. And it's a guy named Steve Bannon, who you've probably heard of. And with any luck, he's going to be in jail by the time this podcast comes out. That'd be really nice. So cross your fingers. And he said the following on his podcast.
We mock your fear. We want you to fear. It's going to be accountability. We are taking apart the administrative state. We're going to destroy the deep state, and we're going to hold everybody responsible that put this republic in the situation it's in today. Accountability, responsibility. And that will come with authority. The authority of Donald John Trump as the 47th president of the United States. Full stop.
He wants to weaponize the Justice Department to go after their political opponents. And he's being very blatant about how he's saying that. And if you've ever crossed these people in any way, or if you didn't vote the right way, guess what? You're one of their political opponents. It may take them a while to get to you. You know, you may not be real high up on the list, but you're one of their opponents. And what scares me is that everyone with a media platform on that side is saying the same thing. Here's Tim Pool and Laura Loomer talking about locking people up and charging them. And Laura even goes as far as to say she wants to execute people.
I'll put it this way. Should Democrats be in jail? No question. When Donald Trump gets elected, should he start locking them up? No question. Should there be lists of Democrats that need to go to jail? 100%. And the reason for that is they've committed crimes. We need to make sure that when Donald Trump wins, we've got an attorney general, a deputy attorney general, a head of the CIA and the FBI. Kash Patel would be fantastic. We can have attorney general. There's some names floating around. And then they can start having their investigators and the feds issuing subpoenas, pulling up evidence, and with real evidence, bring them to judges for warrants. Then these people can spend three years of their lives fighting tooth and nail for the crime against the government for crimes they committed, and we can prove. Yeah. And the reason why we put them on trial is that we can show the whole world we will uncover what you've done. We will make sure everyone knows, and you will be held accountable for it.
Not just jail, they should get the death penalty. You know, we actually used to have the punishment for treason in this country.
When people tell you who they are.
Yeah, there's a very consistent message coming out, right? Whether it's Bannon, whether it's someone like Alito.
Mm-hmm.
And the message is, we don't care. We are here and we are going to do what we want.
Right.
What are you going to do to stop us? And the Alito messaging today, specifically, the message he sent to Congress, you know, is pretty clearly a signifier, right? Like that is a line in the sand that most people in a functioning democracy would take to mean we are in extremely dangerous space right now.
And Alito just doesn't seem to think that there is anything anyone can do to him. I mean, he really does seem to believe that he's above the law, above standards, above norms, above anything resembling a functional, judicial branch, really. You cannot
Absolutely.
have a judicial branch populated with people like this.
No, we can't. And I mean, we're seeing it, right? Like we've seen it with Abbott, where he pardoned Daniel Perry, right?
Right.
What they're showing us and what they're saying, in some cases explicitly, is the only kind of law that matters is the kind of law we institute.
Yeah.
And we've seen it in other states too, where court cases that are tried in predominantly Democratic districts by, what they claim, and this is a right-wing claim, that, it's a Democratic judge and a Democratic jury, those laws don't apply in Republican courts.
Right.
And this is pretty consistent messaging.
Yeah.
From a number of different sources within the same ecosystem.
Well, and then you've got state legislatures and courts trying to pass laws that say that we can impose our state law in other states.
Right.
I live in Washington State. We have a state on the border to the east of us called Idaho. And I don't know if you know much about Idaho, but it's one of the more conservative places in the country.
Yep.
And they have laws basically criminalizing abortion procedures, any kind of abortion procedures, medical, etc., to the point where providers are moving out of the state because they're afraid of being prosecuted. And they have now started trying to make noises about, well, we can inspect women leaving and coming back from Washington State right across the border to make sure that they didn't have an abortion while they were over there. And it's like, number one, the Interstate Commerce Clause says, hi, you really can't do this. This is very unconstitutional. But that obvious constitutional problem aside, you find yourself thinking, what happens when the two states end up in the Supreme Court over this one?
Well, and that's just it, right? Like the Republicans are setting up essentially cases that will be used at the Supreme Court at some level, right? To test everything from interstate commerce in that way to the way that we understand the law for, let's say, things as far as like medical care.
Right.
And, I think for a lot of people, they don't know just how deep this goes, but, this is the kind of stuff like during the Civil War, this was the equivalent of Dred Scott, right? Like these are things that have massive ripples, not just in the states that they're trying to be enacted in, but everywhere else, because there is a level at which they only need to get one case to go to a Supreme Court to change everything. And the people opposing them have to win every time. And that's a very bad place for democracy to be in, right? Like if you're being consistently under attack by what the right would call lawfare, it becomes much harder to function as a democratic society and government.
Oh, absolutely.
And we see that time and again, not just in the United States, but in other places where this kind of stuff has happened. That is usually a signal that things have gone horribly awry in the democratic norms section.
Yes.
And we've never in this country, at least not in any modern sense, had to understand the world through a lens that looks like that.
No.
It's very hard for people to understand the level of danger that these individual pieces pose when they start to not just become individual tests, but they start to become the sum of the whole.
Right. And this has become the sum of the whole for a large chunk of the judiciary, a large chunk of the legislature. We have what kind of seems in crude terms like one big long shit test that's been going on for years. And if you lose even just a little bit, then all of a sudden a huge section of law precedent is now whatever they just said it was.
Yes, exactly. And it tends to be that the law and the way that democratic society in this country has worked is in a reactionary capacity insofar as they deal with things once the damage is done, not trying to head off the danger. And in those situations, in a normal world where we're not dealing with an authoritarian group that is intentionally testing every area of democratic society, you can afford to lose cases occasionally and say, well, that was terrible. Now we have to reorganize and figure out how we're going to move around that. In these cases, it becomes incredibly hard to do that. right? Like we have an incredibly hard situation in that you don't get a chance sometimes to readdress those problems when things are taken away.
Right, right. So like you said, we're lucky that we aren't quite at that point yet.
Yes.
We still have some options. We still have some potential moves to make here, but we're running out of runway.
We are. And it's going to take action that no individual can do alone, right? Like we can't, as a population, reconstitute the courts, for example. That's something that our elected officials have to do, but that's going to take us pressuring them in some way because they don't, for whatever reason, see this as the threat that it is.
And it's going to take a generation worth of time to fix that problem, regardless of how you fix it. The quick fix is putting some more people on the court, and that would help. But in terms of that bench, I read somebody say the other day that, like, if Trump wins, Alito and Thomas are going to retire immediately and be replaced by like some 26-year-old graduates from Liberty University.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's kind of a joke, but not really.
No, I think there's more truth to that than not, right? Like, I think, I think there's a real risk of a complete court collapse, right? In that way, if he wins. And I think there's a real chance if they grant Trump immunity in the next month, which is increasingly looking likely, there has to be a larger conversation about not just the pushback now, but how do we stop the bleeding, let's say, because we will be in a much different place if that's the case. And I think for a lot of us, a lot of the time we are looking at this as a weighted game, right? Because we understand that we as individuals can't really do much to affect true change at the levels we need to. But there is a level where we all, as people of good conscience who do care about democracy, we actually have to do the legwork of making those officials who can actually do that really feel some heat on this in the ways that we can. And people are starting to write letters. People are starting to call officials and really start to have this conversation about the courts and what that actually means. But there's a lot that has to be done, and it's going to take all of us doing it to get that changed.
Absolutely. And we got a little preview of what this could all end up looking like recently. A gentleman by the name of Radley Balco, who's written quite extensively. He's written for The Intercept. He's written for a few other outlets. He wrote a really great book back in the teens called The Rise of the Warrior Cop. And I think that's definitely, must read as far as I'm concerned. And he wrote a piece for his Substack on the Trump immigration and deportation idea. Now, if, you somehow missed it, and I could see how you could, because there's a lot of really horrible stuff out there these days. One of the things Trump has said is that on day one, he's going to start deporting people. He's going to start throwing people who are not citizens out of the country under almost anything he can. And Balco goes through all of this, and he goes through the idea of, what does it cost us to deport somebody? What are the steps involved in that? How much does it cost? What's the process? We have to spend this much money. And he quickly comes to the conclusion that the finances of this just aren't there. It's going to take basically multiplying the current DHS budget by about 100 to get there. We're going to spend like almost $1 trillion, I think he said, to do this particular thing. And the one point that he makes is, I think they could do it a lot cheaper, and they probably will, because they're going to start ignoring the courts. They're going to start not bothering with any of this stuff, because once these people are out, it kind of doesn't matter at that point. Nobody's going to sue you from outside the United States that's in those circumstances.
No. And one of the things that he's going off of, because I've read some of the documents that he's looked at too, talks about denaturalization, right? And so I think that that's one of the things that in all of this, right, we have to understand too, when they're saying denaturalization, that means that if you're a U.S. citizen, they will strip you of your citizenship and remove you.
Right.
And that is a whole different scale than anything that's been done in this country in the modern era, for sure. And I actually don't think there's been a time in our history where those threats have been actually threats that are carry enough weight that they will be carried out. And
Yeah.
like you said, no one's going to be able to sue from outside of the country if and when that takes place.
Yeah. I mean, most of the time, you got somebody coming here under those circumstances, they don't have a whole lot of money. Chances are they spent a whole lot of it on somebody to help them try and come across that way.
Yep.
There's this huge cottage industry of people that get by helping people try and illegally cross the border. And it's awful. And the more you look into that, the worse it gets.
Yes, that is true.
These people have spent, in most cases, their last dime trying to get to this place. And in a lot of cases, the jobs they're taking don't pay a whole lot, but they pay better than the equivalent where they're from. And they can send money back to those people where they're from. And that's where the vast majority of what they earn is going to, is remittances to the folks back home.
Yeah.
So if they end up getting shipped, then they don't really have a whole lot of choice, even if it wasn't legal.
Right.
And the 14th Amendment covers that.
Yep.
If you were born here, you're a citizen. And this is something that they've hated for years, but it's the law of the land and it's the Constitution.
Yep.
And you kind of have to abide by that unless you want to, amend it. And they don't. They're just going to start ignoring it. And it's almost like that old quote about Stalin, fuck the courts. How many divisions do they have?
Exactly. Well, and I think that that's the other part. Like the other part of this being done cheap and quickly is they are going to employ outside actors, right?
Uh-huh.
Like Texas is already employing right-wing militias and intermingling them with law enforcement, right? Like, and that's what will continue to happen and grow if and when this takes place. And, this kind of goes back to everything we were talking about prior with Alito and with Abbott and all these different things. There is a massive retreat going on from the broader consensus rule of law, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it's tough for people to really take in what that means, but traditionally when you have a parallel system of justice being built, you've passed into an authoritarian realm that's pretty wildly inconsistent until it's completely consistent in how inconsistent it is and appears to those who are still trying to make it work in the democratic society. And the Fifth Circuit really is the one that for me kind of signals all of this, right? Because we've already seen how this will look in action, right?
Yes.
And Belko hits on it really, I think, expertly in this idea that the courts get ignored, that rule of law gets set aside, that it is literally just mandate after mandate coming from a political entity, not a lawful entity. And that's really an incredible place for us to even be talking about seriously as a place we may end up.
Yeah. But this is where we are at this point. And this is where a lot of people want us to be.
Yeah.
And it's really quite terrifying to look at the idea that we're this close to the edge of waking up in a place that nobody recognizes anymore.
Yeah. I've written pretty extensively about pseudo-democracy because the pseudo-democracy is this, right? Like we have all the language and the adornments of democracy, but it is not. And there's something profoundly heavy about that. And, it's been one of my arguments with more moderate and centrist liberals is if you really want people to understand the stakes here, you have to tell them clearly what the stakes are. And this is one of those stakes, right? Like this is not the whole ball game, but it's a lot of the ball game. And people need to know just what danger that really poses. And if we have an issue where we already have real fear about the courts, then we have to talk about how it won't be used that way if Biden wins again. We have to have ways that we're going to shore up things like the Supreme Court. And, we have to give a better alternative than just saying, well, this is going to be really bad. And no one's doing that yet at the Democratic Party level, which is what we need, because most of this, democracy itself, unfortunately, is based on feelings and, and the vibe, quote unquote, that there's something better in the works that we are working towards as a group. And if we don't have that, the courts and all of that can and will disregard whatever they can to enact their will.
Mm-hmm. And this is where you get to, with a lot of your stuff about, we have to give people something to focus on. We have to give people an idea of what can be done, that we're not in this position. Because it's so frustrating to have to vote for the lesser of two evils every time. Like we said, there's a lot of stuff Biden's done right, in my opinion. There's a lot of stuff Biden could have done a whole lot better also, in my opinion. And it would be really nice to feel like maybe we were wholeheartedly on board with something like this. And I think part of that comes to giving people a hope that we're not constantly just going to the polls every 4 years to save democracy, that we're not going to the polls every 4 years to just barely claw back from the brink of whatever fascism is on the other side of the ballot at this point, because that's where we're at. And that's where we've been at for 8 years now in terms of elections. And that's exhausting.
It's exhausting. And at some point, people won't believe you anymore if you're not actually doing the thing that has to be done to preserve democracy, right? Like, as much as we all would like quick fixes, the way we actually fix this is going to take us generations of work that are laid out, and there's a plan enacted that is kept to, that isn't just the word hope and a really cool Shepherd fairy print.
Yeah.
And what we've seen is there's a level of neoliberal theater to the Democrats that makes it very hard for their messaging to stick. And, if someone told me tomorrow, you're going to work for the Democratic, Party, and you're going to help them on messaging, what I would tell them is it's not a messaging issue. It's an action issue.
Yeah.
You've messaged on saving and protecting our rights and these things. So do it, because people have seen over the last 4 years that the Democratic Party, in some cases, a lot of the time, can't save the chickens in the chicken house when they're in charge.
Yeah.
And that's a very bad place for a messaging apparatus to be. So you actually have to do the work then of doing it. And yes, some of this is intentional Republican destabilization within the highest parts of the government. And that makes it incredibly hard to get things done. But at the same time, then the Democrats have to say that clearly, clear-eyed, and with a level of honesty that may look weak to some, but in this situation, if you just tell people how it is, even if it's pretty heavy, that actually is going to help you get people to understand some of the stakes and some of the things going on here.
Yeah. And I think that people would respond to that.
I think so too.
Because one of the people that, and as crazy as this is going to sound, one of the points that Dilley makes is that he says that nobody is perfect and nobody's judging anybody based on, priors and past. And it's like, okay, so what if you just told people the truth and explained to them exactly where we are in this situation and copped to failures in the past? Said, we haven't necessarily always handled this better, but we're going to, and keep us honest.
It would not just be a complete tone shift. I think it would be a sobering and refreshing moment for a lot of people. And I know for myself, some of my anger at the Biden administration has been the both sides of the mouth rhetoric. That would clear some of this up. And I think there are a lot of people out there who, especially younger voters, who have not seen forward progress. They've only seen things taken away from them, no matter who's in charge. And that is tough, but you can actually start to correct some of those wrongs just by saying, we've screwed up and we're doing something new and something radical, which is being honest with you about the stakes.
Yeah.
And then acting and actually making what they can happen to correct some of it.
Right. And they don't have much of a window left. That's the other thing that, you got to take into account here, is that the window of how long do we have to start making that kind of shift is getting shorter. There's a lot of people who are just absolutely convinced that they've never seen a country that isn't being run by corrupt shitheads. And
yeah,
at some point, if you want to convince them, you better get cracking, because it's just getting worse.
It gets exponentially harder.
And you need to convince these people if you want them to buy into any kind of a vision of democracy going forward.
Yeah. The longer this goes and the further we get from people actually seeing things work correctly, the harder it gets to bring people back to the table. And part of democracy and the way that it functions is getting people at the table, whether or not they agree. Because sometimes the best thing about democracy is we all yell at each other over a couple beers and say, this is wrong. And I think you're wrong for thinking it. And it goes back and forth. That's been how it's been for 250 years here.
Right.
And if we can't do that because one side has, for all intents and purposes, given up, and the other side has decided that they're going to sweep the board and lie to your face, you have to actually have a way to get people to see it and say, yeah, this is a terrible situation we're in. What steps are you taking or would you want to take to do better? And why is it so bad? And the way that you neuter some of the bullshit from the far right is to say, we've screwed up at some really key things. But because of that, we now have to do better and are willing to, and this is how, and lay out a plan.
Neuter the gotcha, like you said. There's not going to be a gotcha. This is going to be we messed up here.
Yeah.
Here's the plan for how we do better. Where's yours?
Literally, it's accountability. That's the one thing that really would help right now, is for the Democratic Party to say, we did not have the answers and did not do this the right way. We've veered off course from what our goals were. And this is our plan to get us back to being the democratic society that we all know and love, and lay out 25 points for 5 years or 8 years. You'd be in a much better place. The right's been working a plan that they've been systematically adding to for 40 plus years.
Yeah. And we're not going to catch up to that overnight, but we can catch it.
No.
But we've got to start.
We can absolutely catch it. Well, part of the thing is the Republican plan really is reliant on people not knowing what's actually going on. And so if you neuter that ability, you actually gain more ground quicker than they did by lying.
Yeah.
And, this shouldn't be something that isn't known in the highest halls of power. But it seems we've strayed from what is and what isn't, because it all just needs to be focus grouped. And that's just not how this is going to work. You just got to cop to it.
Yeah. And they better start copping to it soon, because
quickly
the window is closing, as it were.
Yeah. We have months left to make that kind of strategy work. From that on, choices get much more fluid and not great, right?
Yeah.
There's no winning for anyone if we go to a place where Trump wins. That's a lose situation.
Real bad.
For everyone except for like 25 or 30 people, really. I mean, truly, there are a handful of people that would do well, quote unquote, in a Trump presidency.
Right.
Couple thousand, maybe. And the rest of us will suffer. And that's not the way this is supposed to work. And it's not the way that any of us would like this to work. And so that just means we have to change the way that we've done things.
Exactly. Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GrizaBJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.